Hello and welcome. Our second lecture on our unit on the Middle Ages is all going to be about the Vikings. Now, the Vikings are going to be attacking all over, which we'll get to in a second. But because they're starting from the north, and so a lot of people in Western Europe who are going to be attacked by them are calling them not Vikings because a Viking, we'll again talk more about the term here in a second, is more of a verb than a name, and the Vikings would have called themselves Vikings. The Northmen, the Norse, the people from the north is who's going to be doing all this attacking of the people of Northern Western Europe. So that's where we're going to start with our section lecture on the Middle Ages. We'll show you a couple maps here in a second, but the Viking people are going to be coming from mostly Scandinavia, your modern day Norway, Sweden's, and Denmark's. So they're going to be the people who are going to be conducting these raids across, and again, the map will make more sense, uh, across the Atlantic, down into the Mediterranean, through Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, and Western Europe. So the Vikings themselves are going to attack and settle in the period from the late 700s to the early 900s AD. The term Viking is a verb in the Norse language. You go a Viking. And so there's still a little bit of scholarly debate over why all of a sudden in the 700s we begin to see these Norse people begin to kind of move and expand outwards. It can be a little bit seen as still kind of the vestiges of the Germanic invasions being pushed from the Huns into these territories. Because remember, when we have the Huns pushing against the Germanic tribes who then push against the frontiers of the Roman Empire, that's really just the pushing that's happening down along that Rhine-Danube border. But there's other places for people to go and move into. And so some of those places are into the Scandinavian countries of northern and northeastern Europe. And so, really, this is still kind of as they get settled and then they begin to kind of move on. Why they chose this period to begin anew, again, is up for scholarly debate. But what historians begin to think is that really the Vikings began to realize that by going abroad, they could gain a lot more wealth and prestige back home rather than what they could get amongst themselves. So when they started pushing out into these areas of Europe, they found that they were very lightly guarded. They were very easy for them to do that. And so this became very easy for them to make a lot of money very quickly. So you'd kind of think of that young men would go and kind of learn their chops on a couple of expeditions abroad with others, and then they would go, and once they've gotten enough money and enough kind of camaraderie and people around them, then they would go on their own expedition, gather as much wealth as they could, and then return back to Scandinavia to live up to this. So you'd be going a Viking to be able to kind of make a name for yourself, to gather wealth. Again, if you put it in our modern parlance, if there's nobody guarding a bank, you would just go in and steal money from the bank because it would be easy. And that's kind of what you have to think that these Vikings are doing. They found a very easy way to cash in um, uh, with minimal, like in guess in quotation marks, effort to be able to get a whole lot of money. Now, these raids created a profound impact on Europe that are going to stretch from Russia in the east all the way through northern and Western Europe to, I mean, northern Spain up into Ireland, and then farther out into the Atlantic Ocean. The Vikings not only went and raided in these areas, but they also set up colonies. And these colonies stretched from as far at west as Newfoundland in Canada, so that's across the Atlantic Ocean. If you're paying attention, this is 500 years before Columbus will cross the ocean blue in 1492, down into Russia. The Vikings are going to establish colonies along the major rivers, the Volga in particular, and establish colonies called Ruses, which is where the term Russia comes from. The Vikings are not only just setting up colonies, but they're attacking Ireland, Anglo-Saxon England, Carolingian France, Islamic Spain, down into the Mediterranean. They're going to conquer and take over the island of Sicily and create a Viking kingdom there. as well as going all the way down into Constantinople. And as we see on the next slide here, we see giant amounts of expeditions all throughout Europe. The Vikings are going to go down, work their way towards Constantinople. The Roman emperors in Constantinople will eventually have a bodyguard of 6'4", 6'5" Viking warriors as their bodyguards. There's Viking runes written into the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The caliphates of Baghdad will sleep on cold desert nights under polar bear skin rugs brought to them and traded by the Vikings. And so they have this giant impact not only going east, but also going into England, Ireland. Iceland is going to be settled and run by the Vikings. The descendants of those Vikings still live in Iceland today, as well as going into Greenland and across the Atlantic into North America and setting up a colony in Newfoundland, living there for a couple hundred years before the Native Americans pushed them out. They're going to live in Greenland for another couple hundred years after that before those kind of settlements are also kind of pushed away. But you can see the global scale that the Vikings are going and doing and their raids. And again, we want to emphasize that Columbus is going in the wake of these Viking expeditions. The Vikings are the first Europeans to sail across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. But again, it's hard for to be able to kind of get any sort of widespread acknowledgement of that because, again, a lot of people don't like to deal with the Vikings in Europe, so that information is kind of insular amongst themselves. The raids, particularly in France, are going to be pretty devastating. The north of France is going to be raided over and over and over again. The same thing that's happening in the east of England. The Vikings are going to raid England so much that they decide, why don't we just live here? And they're going to take over and settle most of East Anglia. Has become a Viking kingdom in England across the North Sea. The attacks on northern France are going to become so frequent and so terrible that the King of France just says, "Here, Vikings, take this." And he gives the north part of France, Normandy, to the Northmen. So it kind of all makes sense there. Gives it to them as their own Viking kingdom to try to keep them in that part of France away from the rest of the French subjects. The key piece of technology that allows the Vikings to do this is the Viking longboat. This is a ship that's held together mostly by glue and pitch and craftsmanship. And the big thing that's nice about it is that one, you can kind of see the one oarsman. I'll bring out the laser pointer down over here so you could row this boat. But again, across the high seas, you could also raise a sail and sail that way. The big key part of what makes the Viking longboat so versatile is that it has what's called a shallow draft, meaning that it could hold, I think the textbook says 300 warriors or 20 tons fully loaded and still be able to sail in as little as 3 feet of water. So if Mr. Cranmer's standing up in the front of the classroom, that's about up to my hips. All right. And so that's a ton of stuff. So you're not just limited to, say, the open oceans like a modern day aircraft carrier is. You can sail up the rivers, you can sail up the Seine as far as Paris, and really be able to not just attack along the coast, but to drive deep into territory. And that's, again, allows the Vikings to be able to expand and do that. We have examples in our modern day of these ships. This was a Viking longboat that sunk off the coast of Sweden, very close to the coast, but got buried in mud, and they were able to kind of dig it up right from this raiding time period. So this is an excellent example of a Viking ship from the time period, built exactly how it would have been in there. And so you would have scores of 5, 6, 7, 20, 30 Viking longboats descending upon a monastery in Ireland or a town in France, and then stealing everything that's not nailed down. And so kind of raiding, stealing stuff, going back on the ships, sailing back to Scandinavia to be able to go and do that. The Vikings, excellent craftsmen in terms of their ironwork. to be able to create shields and swords, as well as taking the jewelry and the precious metals and the coins, melting them down to make their own things as well. And you can kind of see that. If you're a fan of football and the Minnesota Vikings, you know that the Minnesota Vikings have horns on their sides of their helmets. All right, and if Mr. Kramer's in class, he's got his Viking helmet on with the two horns sticking out the side. Well, the Vikings didn't do that. That's an invention of later day historians. That's something that comes about from kind of the romantic era of the mid 1800s, romanticizing this area. Because again, if you're a warrior, you don't want to give anybody any extra things to grab on. So there's nothing coming out the side of your head. We'll get the laser pointer I got. There's no reason to have horns out there. So that's a misconception. That's a later invention that's put on there hundreds of years, about 1,000 years after the Vikings have already conducted all their raids. So we see again, they're still finding helmets and shields and swords being pulled out of the ground. One of the more finer pieces of art left by the Vikings are the Lewis chessmen. And this is a chess set made by Vikings carved from ivory. And you know that ivory is teeth, animal teeth. This is particularly from walrus teeth. Walrus tusks to be able to go and carve down. And again, a fine piece of art, very detailed. And again, this is found in England. And I'm not mistaken, recently, 5, 6 years ago, they found another one of these pieces just randomly in some guy's attic. So they're kind of do that. But you can see the fine detail of that. So one, not only playing chess this far time ago, you can see that the Vikings, not just warriors, but are also craftsmen and artisans as well. The Vikings have a huge impact on England and its development. We talk about the Norse mythology, and if you read the Thor comic books or you're familiar with Thor from the Marvel movies, it's a pretty close grasp of, pretty true to form, what the mythology of the Norse are. But because they're literally set themselves up as a kingdom in England and all that stuff, our own language and has inflection points from the Vikings, including even the days of the week. If you know Thursday, where do we get that day in English? Well, that's Thor's day. It's Thor, the god of thunder's day in there, right? His father is Odin. Another way to pronounce that is Woden, and his day is Woden's day. Wednesday, that's Wednesday, right? Odin's wife, Thor's mother, is Freya. All right, she's got her own day. Freya's day, Friday. So 3 days of the week come from Norse mythology in English in and of itself. And again, that's just the long-term implications of these Viking reigns that they have. The problem for the Western Europeans is that it's not just the Vikings raiding. We also have other raiders as well. One group are the Magyars. Now, the Magyars are an Asiatic people who have moved off the steppes kind of in the wake of the Huns a couple hundred years after that and have moved into Hungary. And then we talked about this before. That's why Hungarian is a much different non-Indo-European language than from the rest of the European countries that surround it because of these Magyar invasions. The Magyars are going to attack from the Danube River to the Rhine River in the late 800s. Now, they're really not interested in settling in these areas. Eventually, they will. But their goal is to go into Eastern, Central, a little bit of Western Europe, and grab captives, particularly kids, to be able to bring back and sell them into the slave markets, particularly of the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean. So that's what they're looking to do. Another group, a third group, we have the Vikings, we have the Magyars, and we have the Muslims. The Muslims are also conducting raids from the 800s to the 900s against the Western Europeans. They're attacking from the Atlantic, north from the Mediterranean, and are striking as far inland as Switzerland. Again, we're not seeing like what we saw in the previous lecture with a Muslim invasion force marching on Paris, being defeated at Tours by Charles Martel. Again, more hit-and-run raids. What can we steal that's not nailed down? And then be able to grab any slaves, carry them back with us to that. So if you're in Western Europe, you're in Northern Europe, you're in Central Europe, you're under attack from the east by the Magyars. You're under attack from the south and the west from the Muslims. You're under attack by the north, the south, the east, and the west by the Vikings. So these cumulative effects of all these raids really goes and changes the entire outlook that the Western Europeans are going to have, which is going to vastly influence how the rest of the Middle Ages history goes. So the big effect of these raids, if you're a Western European, you're living constantly in fear because you have no idea when the next raid is going to come from where, from who. Mothers are telling their kids, eat your vegetables, or the Vikings will come take you in the night. Right? And so this is a literal boogeymen who are out there, who you constantly have to be checking over your shoulder, particularly in the campaigning and raiding months of the Northern European summer. So the Western Europeans living in constant fear from everybody. Kings, whether it just be the Frankish kings or other kingdoms throughout Europe, can't effectively defend their lands. Remember, if you have one army, it can only be in one place at one time. The Vikings are attacking to the north and you bring your army to the north, well, then the people in the south aren't protected from the Muslims. If you go to the south, then they're not protected from the Magyars in the east. So the kings, even as kind of driven as they are to willingness to protect their subjects, they just can't do that because of the again and again and again attacks by not just the Vikings, but all these different groups. So, because the kings can't effectively defend their lands, if you're paying taxes, if you're looking for the kings to defend you and they're not doing it, you're going to look to somebody else. So, people begin to look to more local leaders to provide help for them. And this is going to cause a further splintering of Western Europe. We talked about in the previous lecture how we have Charlemagne's empire, then we moved and split that up into three giant sections in the Treaty of Verdun. And now those Frankish kings are having all sorts of problems protecting their people. And so people begin to look to more local leaders who have the money and cash to build up defenses like castles so that people can go in there to protect themselves. People begin to look to them for help, begin to pay their taxes to them. Their kings are not getting that. They begin to fight, and we see a further splintering and fragmentation of Europe. So we've gone from a united Western Europe under the Roman Empire, a splintering during the aftermath of the fall of Rome, Charlemagne kind of reuniting it, and now it even further splintering and fracturing than worse than we've seen ever before. And this is going to have a giant impact on the rest of European development all the way up into the 1640s after the 30 Years' War. So picture yourself as someone, again, living in northern France. You're under attack from the Vikings and the Magyars and the Muslims. So this is not a fun time for anybody of wealth. And so this fear that's constantly going on there is going to cause people to look for solutions to help them out. And those solutions are going to be in the form of local leaders. And those local leaders are going to form their own social, political, economic structures outside of what the kings of Europe that have established by this point, and we'll see how this further changes and evolves European development.